In 1995, a man walked into Roosevelt Elementary School and introduced himself as the substitute teacher. By the end of that day, 17 children had vanished without a trace for 30 years. No one questioned who he really was. Then a retired detective found his photograph in a case file from 1987. The same face, the same name, the same substitute teacher. But according to official records, that man had died 8 years before he ever stepped foot in that classroom. The morning mist clung to the school parking lot like a gray shroud. When Thomas Whitmore arrived at Roosevelt Elementary, he carried a black leather briefcase, worn at the edges, and wore a navy suit that seemed too formal for a substitute teacher. His footsteps echoed across the empty hallway. As he approached the main office at exactly 7:30 a.m., Eleanor Davies, the school secretary, looked up from her coffee and smiled. She had been working at Roosevelt for 12 years, and substitutes were nothing new. Most arrived flustered, asking a dozen questions about lesson plans and classroom procedures. But Thomas Whitmore was different. He stood calmly at her desk, hands folded behind his back. "Waiting. You must be the substitute for Mrs. Peterson's class," Eleanor said. Pulling out the sign-in sheet, "She called in sick this morning. 5th grade mathematics," Thomas replied, his voice soft but precise. "Room 1 for B." Eleanor slid the clipboard across the desk. Thomas signed his name in careful, flowing script, Thomas J. Whitmore. His handwriting was old-fashioned, almost Victorian in its precision. "The lesson plans are on Mrs. Peterson's desk." Eleanor continued, "The children arrive at 8:15. Is this your first time at Roosevelt?" Thomas shook his head. "I've taught in many schools over the years." There was something about his tone that made Eleanor pause. Most substitutes offered their credentials, mentioned which district they usually worked for or complained about. The early morning call. Thomas Whitmore simply stood there, as if waiting for permission to proceed. "Well," Eleanor said, filing the sign-in sheet, "let me know if you need anything." Thomas nodded once, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the elementary wing. Eleanor watched him go, noting how his footsteps seemed to echo longer than they should in the empty hallway. 23 children filed into Mrs. Peterson's classroom, chattering about weekend plans and the upcoming Halloween party. They fell silent when they saw the stranger standing behind their teacher's desk. He had written his name on the chalkboard in that same careful script, Mr. Whitmore. "Good morning, class," Thomas said, his voice carrying an odd authority that made even the most restless students sit up straight. "Mrs. Peterson is feeling unwell today. I'll be your teacher." Sarah Chen, 8 years old and perpetually curious, raised her hand. "Are you a real teacher or just a substitute?" Thomas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What do you think makes a teacher real?" Sarah, teaching certificate, college degree. "I have been teaching longer than any of you have been alive," Thomas replied. "Perhaps that makes me more real than most." The children exchanged glances. There was something strange about the way he spoke, as if he were from another time entirely. But children are adaptable, and within minutes they had settled into their morning routine. Thomas opened his briefcase and withdrew a rolled book that looked impossibly old. The leather binding was cracked with age, and the pages were yellowed. At the edges, he called attendance, but instead of simply marking present or absent, he made careful notes next to each name. "Marcus Webb. Here, Mr. Whitmore." Thomas wrote something in the old book. Marcus tried to see what it was, but the teacher's handwriting was too small to read from his desk. "Jennifer Mills, present." Another note. "David Rodriguez. Here." Thomas paused, studying David for a long moment before writing in the book. David shifted uncomfortably under the teacher's gaze. The attendance continued until all 23 children had been accounted for. But instead of closing the book, Thomas flipped to a different page and began calling names that weren't on Mrs. Peterson's roster. "Timothy Chen, that's my brother," Sarah called out. "He's in 3rd grade. Ashley Morrison, she graduated last year," said Jennifer Mills. Thomas continued calling names, 17 in total. That belonged to children who weren't in the classroom. Some were students from other grades. Others had graduated, and a few names belonged to children no one recognized at all. Michael Davidson, silence. Chloe Winters, more silence. Rebecca Stone. The children looked around at each other, confused. Thomas closed the old book and smiled that strange, distant smile. "Now we begin," he said. 10:30 a.m. The first disappearance. Seathams had been teaching for 2 hours when he made his first unusual request. The children were working on multiplication tables when he approached Marcus Webb's desk. "Marcus," Thomas said quietly, "would you take this note to the principal's office?" Marcus looked at the folded paper Thomas handed him. It was sealed with what looked like red wax, old-fashioned and formal. "Should I wait for a reply?" Marcus asked. "No need," Thomas said. "Simply deliver the note and return to your family." "My family?" "Your mother is waiting for you in the parking lot." Marcus frowned. "But it's not time to go home yet." "Time is relative, Marcus. Your mother is waiting." Marcus took the note and left the classroom. Sarah Chen watched him walk down the hallway toward the main office. She expected to see him return within a few minutes, but as the morning stretched on, Marcus's desk remained empty. By lunchtime, 6 more children had been sent on various errands by Thomas Whitmore. Jennifer Mills was asked to return a book to the library. David Rodriguez was sent to retrieve supplies from the storage room. Ashley Park was asked to take a message to the nurse. None of them returned. The remaining 16 children began to whisper among themselves. Thomas seemed not to notice their growing anxiety as he continued teaching, as if nothing unusual was happening. "Where did Jennifer go?" Sarah whispered to her desk partner. "Emily Watson. Maybe they all went home sick," Emily replied, but her voice was uncertain. Thomas appeared at Sarah's desk so suddenly that both girls jumped. "Sarah," he said in that soft, precise voice, "I need you to take this attendance sheet to Mrs. Davies in the office." Sarah looked at the paper Thomas held out. It was the same yellowed parchment as his roll book, covered in that careful, Victorian handwriting. "Why can't someone else go?" Sarah asked. "Because it has your name on it." Sarah stared at the paper. She couldn't read the writing, but she could make out one word at the top, selected. "I don't want to go," Sarah said, her voice small. Thomas knelt beside her desk, bringing his face level with hers, up close. Sarah could see that his eyes were an unusual gray color, almost silver, and they seemed much older than the rest of his face. "Sarah," he said gently, "do you know what makes a good student?" Sarah shook her head. "Obedience. Trust, the willingness to go where you're needed." "But what if I'm needed here?" Thomas smiled, and for a moment, his expression seemed almost sad. "You're needed elsewhere now." Sarah took the paper with trembling hands and left the classroom. Emily watched her best friend walk down the hallway and somehow knew she would never see her again. When the lunch bell rang, only 8 children remained in room 1-4B. They filed out to the cafeteria, whispering frantically among themselves about their missing classmates. "Maybe they all got food poisoning," suggested Tommy Liu. At the same time, Emily Watson replied, "That doesn't make sense. My mom packed my lunch," said Kate Morrison. "I'm not eating cafeteria food." They sat together at their usual table, but the empty seats felt like missing teeth in a smile. Emily kept looking toward the classroom hallway, hoping to see Sarah or Marcus or any of the others returning. Instead, she saw Thomas Whitmore walking through the cafeteria, moving between the tables with purpose. He wasn't eating lunch or supervising like the other teachers. He was watching the children, studying them with that same intense gaze he'd used during attendance. He stopped at the 3rd grade table and spoke quietly to a small boy with red hair. The boy nodded, gathered his things, and followed Thomas out of the cafeteria. "That's Timothy Chen," Emily whispered. "Sarah's little brother." They watched through the cafeteria windows as Thomas walked Timothy across the parking lot toward a black sedan parked at the far edge of the school grounds. Emily couldn't see the license plate from that distance, but she could see Thomas open the car door and help Timothy into the back seat. The car drove away, and Timothy Chen was never seen again. Eleanor Davies was updating attendance records when she noticed the discrepancies. According to the morning sign-in sheets, 23 children had arrived for school, but the lunch count showed only 8 children present in Mrs. Peterson's class. She called down to room 1-4B, but there was no answer. concerned. Eleanor walked down to the elementary wing herself. She found Thomas Whitmore standing at the chalkboard, erasing the morning's mathematics problems. 8 children sat at their desks, silent and pale-faced. "Mr. Whitmore," Eleanor said, "I'm showing 15 children absent from your class who were marked present this morning. Where are they?" Thomas turned from the chalkboard, and Eleanor was struck by how calm he appeared. "Children come and go, Mrs. Davies. Some were picked up early. Others transferred to different classes, without signing out, without parent authorization. Perhaps there was a miscommunication." Eleanor frowned. In 12 years at Roosevelt Elementary, she had never seen such a massive attendance discrepancy. "I need to see your substitute credentials, Mr. Whitmore." Thomas nodded and opened his black briefcase. He withdrew a manila folder and handed it to Eleanor. Inside was a teaching certificate from the state of Iowa, issued to Thomas J. Whitmore. The certificate looked official, but something about it troubled Eleanor. The paper seemed too old, and the state seal looked different from the modern versions she was familiar with. "The certificate is from 1962, Eleanor said. "I've been teaching for many years, but it would have expired decades ago. You need current certification to substitute teach." Thomas smiled that distant, sad smile. "Time is relative, Mrs. Davies. Experience transcends paperwork." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. There was something wrong here, something fundamentally off about this man and the situation. "I need to call the district office." "Of course," Thomas said. "Do what you must." Eleanor hurried back to the main office and immediately called the Cedar Falls School District's substitute teacher coordinator. "We didn't send anyone to Roosevelt today," the coordinator told her. "Thomas Whitmore isn't in our system." Eleanor's hands shook as she hung up the phone and immediately dialed 911. Officer Daniel Murphy arrived at Roosevelt Elementary within 15 minutes of Eleanor's call. He was a young patrolman, only 2 years out of the academy, and missing children cases were not his specialty. But as he walked through the school's main entrance, he could feel the tension radiating from the staff. Eleanor met him at the front desk, her face pale and drawn. "The substitute teacher in room 1 for B," she said without preamble. 15 children from his class are unaccounted for." "Unaccounted for how?" "They were here this morning. Now they're gone. No sign-out slips, no parent pickup authorization, no record of early dismissal." Officer Murphy followed Eleanor down the hallway to room 14B. Through the open doorway, he could see 8 children sitting at their desks and a tall man in a navy suit writing on the chalkboard. "Mr. Whitmore," Officer Murphy called out. Thomas turned from the board. "Yes, officer. I need to ask you some questions about the missing students from your class." "Of course." "Children," Thomas addressed the 8 remaining students, "please work quietly on your mathematics while I speak with the officer." Officer Murphy gestured for Thomas to step into the hallway. Up close, the substitute teacher seemed ordinary enough, middle-aged, professional appearance, calm demeanor, but something about his eyes bothered Murphy. They were too knowing, too old. "Where are the missing children, Mr. Whitmore?" "I'm afraid I don't understand the question." 15 children were in your class this morning. Only 8 remain. Where did the others go?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Some were picked up by their parents. Others were transferred to different activities. Children move about schools all the time, officer. Not without proper documentation. There's no record of any early pickups or transfers. Perhaps there was an administrative error." Officer Murphy studied Thomas's face, looking for signs of deception. The man seemed genuinely puzzled by the questions, as if he couldn't understand why anyone would be concerned. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to see some identification." Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a wallet from it. He produced a driver's license issued to Thomas J. Whitmore. Murphy examined the license carefully. The photo matched the man standing before him, and the license appeared valid, but the issue date was October 1987. "This license expired 8 years ago," Murphy said. "Has it? Time passes so quickly. You've been driving with an expired license for 8 years?" "I don't drive much anymore." Murphy handed the license back, his suspicion growing. "How did you get to school this morning?" "I walked." "From where?" "I don't recall the address." I've moved frequently over the years. Officer Murphy was beginning to realize he was dealing with someone who was either deliberately evasive or suffering from some form of mental impairment. Mr. Whitmore, I need you to come with me to the station for questioning. Am I under arrest? No, but 15 children are missing from your classroom. I need to understand what happened to them. Thomas nodded calmly. Very well, let me gather my things. He returned to room 1-4B and collected his black briefcase. The 8 remaining children watched him with wide, frightened eyes. Children, Thomas said, continue with your studies. Your regular teacher will return tomorrow. As they walked toward the main office, Officer Murphy asked, what's in the briefcase? Teaching materials, nothing more. But as they passed under the hallway lights, Murphy could have sworn he heard something moving inside the briefcase, a sound like whispered voices or rustling paper. Asterisk by the time Officer Murphy had taken Thomas Whitmore to the Cedar Falls police station, word of the missing children had spread throughout the community. Parents began arriving at Roosevelt Elementary, demanding answers about their children's whereabouts. Eleanor Davies tried to maintain order in the main office as 15 sets of frantic parents crowded around her desk. Where is my daughter? Demanded Patricia Chen, Sarah's mother. The school called and said there was an incident, but no one will tell me what happened. We're investigating, Eleanor replied, her voice strained. The police are questioning the substitute teacher. What substitute teacher? Asked Robert Webb, Marcus's father. Peterson was supposed to be teaching today. Mrs. Peterson called in sick this morning. A substitute came in to cover her class. Who authorized him? Patricia Chen's voice was rising. Don't you people do background checks? Eleanor had no good answer. The truth was that no one had authorized Thomas Whitmore. He had simply appeared that morning, signed in, and been allowed to teach. The district's failure to send a replacement for Mrs. Peterson should have meant the class would be covered by another teacher or divided among existing classes. Instead, a complete stranger had been given access to 23 children, and now 15 of them were gone. Dr. Raymond Hayes, the school principal, emerged from his office looking pale and shaken. He had spent the last hour on the phone with the district superintendent, the school board, and the local FBI field office. Parents, Dr. Hayes announced, I understand your concern and frustration. The Cedar Falls Police Department is treating this is a missing persons case. They're questioning the substitute teacher and reviewing all security footage. Security footage? Asked Maria Rodriguez, David's mother. You mean you have video of what happened? Dr. Hayes hesitated. We're reviewing the footage now. What he didn't tell the parents was that the security cameras had malfunctioned that morning. The footage from the elementary wing was corrupted, showing only static and distorted images. The parking lot cameras had recorded normally, but they showed no unusual activity, no children leaving the building, no unauthorized vehicles. It was as if 15 children had simply vanished into thin air. Asterisk. Detective Angela Ross had been called in to handle the case. She was a 20-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department, experienced in missing persons investigations, and she didn't like what she was seeing. Thomas Whitmore sat in interview. Room 2, his hands folded calmly in his lap, his black briefcase on the table beside him. He had agreed to be questioned without requesting a lawyer, which was either a sign of innocence or supreme confidence. Mr. Whitmore, Detective Ross began. Let's start with the basics. What's your current address? I don't have a permanent address. I move frequently for work. What kind of work? I'm a substitute teacher. For which district? Various districts. I go where I'm needed. Detective Ross consulted her notes. The Cedar Falls district has no record of you. They didn't request a substitute for Roosevelt Elementary today. Perhaps there was a miscommunication. Who called you about the job? Thomas paused, as if considering the question carefully. I don't recall receiving a call. I simply knew I was needed. You simply knew. Teaching is a calling, detective. Sometimes we're drawn to where we're needed most. Detective Ross studied Thomas's face. He seemed genuinely puzzled by her questions, as if he couldn't understand why she was making such a complicated matter out of something so simple. Mr. Whitmore, 15 children are missing from the class you were teaching. Their parents are frantic with worry. I need you to tell me exactly what happened to those children. They went where they were needed, Thomas replied. What does that mean? Some children are meant for different paths. They weren't meant to stay in that classroom. Detective Ross felt a chill. Are you saying you took them somewhere? I helped them find their way. Their way to where? Thomas smiled that distant, sad smile. To where they belong. Detective Ross leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, I need you to understand the seriousness of this situation. 15 children are missing. If you know where they are, you need to tell me now. They're not missing, Detective. They're exactly where they're supposed to be. And where is that? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost wistful. Do you know what it's like? To be forgotten, Detective. I'm sorry. To live in a world that has moved on without you. To watch decades pass while you remain unchanged. To see children grow up and grow old while you stay the same. Detective Ross felt the conversation slipping away from her. Mr. Whitmore, are you saying you took those children? I gave them a choice. Stay in a world that would forget them. Or come with me to a place where they'll never be forgotten. What place? Thomas opened his briefcase. Detective Ross tensed, ready to react if he pulled out a weapon. Instead, he withdrew that old leather-bound roll book. Every child who has ever been in my class is recorded here, Thomas said, opening the book. Their names, their faces, their voices, they live on in these pages. Detective Ross looked at the open book. The pages were covered in names written in that careful, Victorian script. Some of the entries were dated decades ago: 1962, 1975, 1983. Others were more recent. At the bottom of the current page, written in fresh ink, were 17 names, 15 she recognized from the missing children. Roster. The other two names made her blood run cold. Timothy Chen, age 8, Mrs. Peterson. Age 30 for what happened to Mrs. Peterson, Detective Ross demanded. Thomas looked up from the book with confusion. She called in sick. No, she didn't. We spoke to her husband. She never called the school. She left for work this morning and never arrived. Thomas blinked slowly, as if processing new information. Then she must have needed to come with me too. Detective Ross stood abruptly. Where are they? Where are Mrs. Peterson and the children? They're safe, Thomas said. They're with me. With you where? Thomas closed the roll book gently. In a place where time doesn't matter, where teachers and students can exist together without the interference of bureaucracy or growing old or being forgotten. Detective Ross had heard enough. She left the interview room and immediately called for backup units to search every property associated with Thomas Whitmore. But as she would soon discover, Thomas J. Whitmore owned no property. He had no rental agreements, no utility bills, no credit cards, no bank accounts, according to every official record. Thomas J. Whitmore had died in a car accident on December 3, 1987. The disappearance of 15 children and one teacher made national news. FBI agents flooded Cedar Falls, setting up a command center at the police station and coordinating search efforts across 3 states. Agent Sarah Martinez, a specialist in child abduction cases, took over the investigation from Detective Ross. Her first priority was understanding who Thomas Whitmore really was and how a dead man had managed to walk into an elementary school and vanish with 16 people. The fingerprints taken from Thomas during his arrest matched those of Thomas J. Whitmore, a former teacher from Nebraska who had died 8 years earlier. The dental records matched. Even a DNA sample matched genetic material recovered from Whitmore's 1987 accident scene. It's impossible, Agent Martinez told Detective Ross as they reviewed the case files. Either our forensics are completely wrong, or we're dealing with someone who shouldn't exist. The search for the missing children expanded nationwide. Thomas's photograph was distributed to every law enforcement agency in the country. His face appeared on milk cartons and missing children websites. But despite the massive manhunt, no trace of Thomas Whitmore or any of the missing children was found. The break in the case came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Helen Kowalski, an elderly woman who lived 3 blocks from Roosevelt Elementary, called the police tip line with information. About the morning of October 15th, I saw him walking, she told Detective Ross, the man in the nice suit. He was walking down Maple Street around 7 in the morning, but he wasn't walking normally. What do you mean? He was walking backwards, like he was trying to retrace his steps, and there were children with him. Detective Ross felt her pulse quicken. How many children? Hard to say. They were walking in a line behind him, all holding hands. Must have been 15 or 20 of them. But here's the strange part, they were all different ages. Some looked like teenagers, others were little ones, maybe 6 or 7. And they were all wearing clothes from different time periods, like they were going to a costume party. Detective Ross grabbed a notepad. What time was this? 7:15, maybe 7:20. I remember because I was getting my newspaper from the porch. Which direction were they walking? Toward the old cemetery on Hill Street. Hillcrest Cemetery was the oldest burial ground in Cedar Falls, dating back to the 1800s. Detective Ross had driven past it countless times, but had never paid much attention to the weathered headstones and overgrown paths. Detective Ross and Agent Martinez arrived at Hillcrest Cemetery with a team of FBI forensics specialists. The cemetery was larger than it appeared from the road, with sections dating back to the Civil War era. They found Thomas Whitmore's grave in the oldest section of the cemetery. The headstone was simple granite, weathered by decades of rain and snow. Thomas James Whitmore, 19 to 51987, beloved teacher, he never forgot a student. This doesn't make sense, Agent Martinez said, staring at the grave. If he died in 1987, who was the man we arrested? Detective Ross knelt beside the headstone, brushing away dead leaves and debris. Carved into the base of the stone, in letters so small they were almost invisible, was an additional inscription. The classroom never ends. A groundskeeper approached them. An elderly man with soil-stained hands and curious eyes. You folks looking for someone in particular? He asked. Thomas Whitmore, Detective Ross replied. Can you tell us anything about this grave? The groundskeeper studied the headstone. Old Tom? Haven't thought about him in years. Used to be a teacher at the elementary school back in the 80s. Do you know how he died? Car accident, I think. Real shame. He loved those kids. Used to bring his classes here for history lessons. Said the cemetery was full of stories that needed to be remembered. Agent Martinez made notes as the groundskeeper continued. Funny thing, though, ever since he was buried here, we've had strange reports from visitors. People saying they see a man in an old-fashioned suit walking among the graves, always followed by children. Different children each time. Some folks say they look like they're from different decades, clothes, hairstyles, that sort of thing. But they're always well-behaved, always quiet. Detective Ross felt a chill despite the afternoon sun. Have you ever seen this yourself? The groundskeeper nodded slowly. Few times over the years. Always around dawn or dusk. The man matches the description of Thomas Whitmore, but younger somehow. And the children? He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. What about the children? They look happy, peaceful, like they're exactly where they wanted to be. Agent Martinez had spent a day reviewing missing children cases from across the Midwest, looking for any connection to Thomas Whitmore or similar disappearances. What she found chilled her to the bone. Over the past 8 years, since Whitmore's death, there had been 17 separate incidents of children vanishing from schools across Iowa, Nebraska, and Illinois. In each case, the children had disappeared during school hours while under the supervision of a substitute teacher. The substitute was always described the same way: middle-aged man, professional appearance, old-fashioned mannerisms, carried a black briefcase. In several cases, witnesses mentioned the substitute's unusual eyes, gray or silver, and much older than his apparent age. Most disturbing of all, in 11 of the 17 cases, the substitute had signed in using the name Thomas Whitmore. We're not dealing with an isolated incident, Agent Martinez told the task force assembled in Cedar Falls. This has been happening for 8 years, across multiple states. Detective Ross studied the map where red pins marked each disappearance. How many children total? 137 children, plus 14 teachers and staff members. The room fell silent as the magnitude of the situation became clear. The pattern is always the same. Agent Martinez continued. The substitute appears without authorization, teaches for a single day, and by evening, multiple children are missing. Local investigations find no trace of the substitute or the children. Until now, Detective Ross said, "We actually arrested him this time, but the man we arrested is dead, officially dead for 8 years. Thomas Whitmore sat in his holding cell, exactly as he had for 5 days. He hadn't touched the meals brought to him. He hadn't slept. He simply sat on the narrow bench, staring at the wall, occasionally writing in his old roll book. Detective Ross watched him through the observation window. In 5 days of interrogation, Thomas had never changed his story. The children were safe. They were where they belonged. They were with him, Mr. Whitmore, Detective Ross said, entering the cell. We know about the other schools, Nebraska, Illinois. We know you've been taking children for 8 years. Thomas looked up from his book. Have I? 137 children, 14 adults, all missing after encounters with you. Missing implies they were lost. These children were found. Found by whom? By someone who understood their value. Someone who would never let them be forgotten. Detective Ross sat across from Thomas on the cell's single chair. Help me understand. What happens to the children after you take them? Thomas smiled that distant, sad smile. They learn. They grow. They become part of something larger than themselves. Part of what? The eternal classroom. A place where curiosity never dies. Where questions are always answered. Where every student matters. Where? Is this classroom? Thomas gestured around the cell. Everywhere. Nowhere. It exists in the spaces between seconds. In the pause between one thought and the next. Detective Ross was beginning to understand that traditional interrogation techniques wouldn't work with Thomas Whitmore. He seemed to exist in a reality that operated by different rules. The children's families want them back. She said, their families have forgotten them already. Time erases everything: memories, faces, love. But in my classroom, nothing is ever forgotten. That's not true. The families are desperate to find their children. Thomas opened his roll book and showed Detective Ross a page filled with names. Do you know any of these children, Detective? Ross studied the names. They were written in the same careful script, but the dates beside them went back decades: 1963, 1971, 1984. These children disappeared years ago. Thomas continued. Some of their parents are dead now. Their siblings have grown up and moved away. The world has forgotten them completely. But I remember everyone. He turned to a more recent page, pointing to familiar names: Sarah Chen, Marcus Webb, Jennifer Mills. In 20 years, will anyone remember Sarah Chen? Will the world care that she once raised her hand in mathematics class and asked what makes a teacher real? Will anyone remember that Marcus Webb was afraid of thunderstorms but loved butterflies? Detective Ross felt an unexpected sadness as she realized Thomas's point. But I will remember, Thomas said softly, in my classroom. Sarah will always be 8 years old, always curious, always asking questions. Marcus will always be the boy who collected butterflies in mason jars. They will never grow old, never be forgotten, never die. You're talking about keeping children prisoners. I'm talking about preserving childhood, about creating a place where innocence lasts forever. Detective Ross stood to leave, but Thomas's next words stopped her. Detective, do you remember your third-grade teacher? She paused. Mrs. Henderson. Do you remember her face, her voice? The way she smelled like chalk and perfume. Detective Ross found herself smiling at the memory. She used to wear these bright blue dresses and click her fingernails on the chalkboard when we weren't paying attention. And if Mrs. Henderson walked past you on the street today, would you recognize her? Detective Ross considered the question. Mrs. Henderson would be in her 70s now, probably retired, possibly dead. The woman who had taught her to read, who had encouraged her love of mystery novels, had become just a vague memory. Probably not, she admitted. That's what I'm trying to prevent, Thomas said. The slow erosion of memory. The way teachers and students fade from each other's lives until they're nothing but names. In old yearbooks, The case took an unexpected turn when Agent Martinez received a call from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. A researcher there had been following the Thomas Whitmore investigation and had discovered something extraordinary. Agent Martinez, the researcher said, "We've been tracking missing children cases that match your pattern, and we found something you need to see." "What kind of something?" "Photographs. School photographs of missing children taken after they disappeared." Agent Martinez felt her blood chill. "That's impossible. We thought so too. But we have 17 separate photos from different school districts across the Midwest. All show the same thing, missing children appearing in class photos taken years after they vanished. The photographs arrived by courier that afternoon." Agent Martinez spread them across the conference table, and what she saw defied explanation. The first photo was from Lincoln Elementary in Des Moines, Iowa, dated 1991. It showed a third-grade class of 22 students. In the back row, circled in red, was the face of Amy Patterson, a girl who had disappeared from a Nebraska school in 1989. The second photo was from Jefferson Middle School in Illinois, dated 1993. Among the seventh graders was Michael Chang, who had vanished from his Iowa classroom in 1990. Photo after photo showed the same impossible pattern. Children who had disappeared years earlier, showing up in class pictures from different schools, looking exactly the same age as when they had vanished. This is either an elaborate hoax or we're dealing with something beyond a normal investigation. Agent Martinez told Detective Ross. The most recent photograph made Detective Ross's hands shake. It was from Riverside Elementary in Nebraska, dated just 2 weeks earlier, October 10, 1995. In the front row of a kindergarten class photo, smiling at the camera, was Timothy Chen, Sarah's little brother, who had disappeared with the others. On October 15th, appeared in a school photo taken 5 days before he vanished. Detective Ross entered Thomas Whitmore's cell for what would be their last conversation. She carried the photographs Agent Martinez had received, and she was no longer certain what questions to ask. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, "we have photographs of the missing children appearing in schools across the country. How is that possible?" Thomas looked at the photos with interest, but no surprise. "Time moves differently in my classroom." "What does that mean?" "Linear time is a human construct, detective. Past, present, and future exist simultaneously. My students can attend school in 1995 and also appear in a photograph from 1991. That's impossible." "Is it? You've seen the evidence." Detective Ross spread the photos across the cell floor. "Where are they really? Where are the children?" Thomas stood and walked to the cell's small window. Outside, the October afternoon was fading into evening. "They're everywhere they've ever been," he said, sitting in mathematics class, playing at recess, raising their hands to answer questions. "They exist in all the moments of their childhood, simultaneously, but their parents want them back in this time, in this reality." Thomas turned from the window, and for the first time since his arrest, he looked genuinely sad. Their parents want them to grow up, to become teenagers who stop asking questions and start taking childhood for granted, to become adults who forget the wonder of learning something new, to become old people who can't remember their teachers' names. That's called life, Mr. Whitmore. That's called death, detective. The slow death of curiosity, imagination, and joy. Thomas sat back down and opened his roll book to a blank page. He began writing, and Detective Ross could see her own name appearing in that careful script. "What are you doing, adding you to my class roster? I'm not a child. Everyone is a child in my classroom. Age is just another human construct, detective." Ross felt a strange dizziness, as if the walls of the cell were shifting around her. For a moment, she could swear she smelled chalk dust and heard the sound of children laughing. "Do you remember?" Thomas asked, still writing, "what it felt like to be 8 years old and believe that your teacher knew everything in the world?" The memory hit Detective Ross like a physical blow. She was sitting in Mrs. Henderson's third-grade classroom, watching her teacher write spelling words on the chalkboard, convinced that this woman in the bright blue dress was the smartest person who had ever lived. "I remember," she whispered. "That feeling never has to end." The dizziness grew stronger. Detective Ross gripped the edge of the bench to steady herself. "What's happening to me?" "You're remembering what it means to be a student." The cell began to fade around the edges, and Detective Ross found herself sitting at a small wooden desk. The holding cell was gone, replaced by a classroom with tall windows and sunlight streaming. Across worn wooden floors, 23 desks filled the room, and in each desk sat a child. She recognized them immediately: Sarah Chen, Marcus Webb, Jennifer Mills, Timothy Chen, and all the others who had vanished from Roosevelt Elementary. But there were other children too, boys and girls in clothing from different decades, representing different eras of education. Some wore Depression-era hand-me-downs, others sported 1960s shifts and Oxford shoes. Still others dressed in modern jeans and sneakers. At the front of the classroom stood Thomas Whitmore, looking exactly as he had in the Cedar Falls holding cell, but somehow more substantial, more real. "Welcome to the eternal classroom, Detective Ross," he said. "Here, every question has an answer. Every student matters, and no one is ever forgotten." Detective Ross looked around the classroom and realized she wasn't afraid. For the first time in decades, she felt the pure excitement of learning something new. "How long do I stay?" she asked. Thomas smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "Time doesn't exist here. You can stay forever, or you can leave whenever you choose. And the children, they're free to go at any time, but most choose to stay." Detective Ross looked at Sarah Chen, who was solving a mathematics problem at the chalkboard. "Why do they choose to stay?" "Because here, they're valued for their curiosity rather than their compliance. Here, they can ask why and what if and how come without being told. They're too young to understand." As Detective Ross sat in her student desk, she felt herself growing younger, not physically, but mentally. The cynicism and world weariness of 20 years in law enforcement began to fade, replaced by wonder and possibility. Agent Martinez found Detective Ross's empty clothing in Thomas Whitmore's cell. The next morning, the cell was unlocked, but the security cameras showed no one entering or leaving. Detective Ross had simply vanished. Thomas Whitmore was gone too, but he had left his roll book behind. Agent Martinez opened it carefully, expecting to find the names of all the missing children. Instead, she found pages and pages of detailed notes about each student, their favorite subjects, their fears, their dreams, their personalities. It read like the world's most comprehensive psychological profile of childhood itself. On the final page, written in fresh ink, was a new entry: Detective Angela Ross, age 40, to return to 3rd grade. October 26, 1995, still believes teachers know everything, still raises her hand for every question, still loves mystery stories. Retired FBI agent Sarah Martinez, now 73 years old, sat in her study reading through case files she had never been able to close. The Thomas Whitmore investigation had haunted her entire career. Defying every attempt at rational explanation, she had followed up on every lead, tracked down every witness, analyzed every piece of evidence. The missing children were never found. Thomas Whitmore was never seen again. Detective Angela Ross remained listed as missing, though her case had been closed after 7 years. But every year on October 15th, Agent Martinez received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was always the same thing: a school photograph. This year's photo showed a 5th grade class from somewhere in Vermont. 23 children smiled at the camera, but Agent Martinez's attention was drawn to one face in the back row: Detective Angela Ross, looking exactly as she had 30 years ago, wearing a child's school uniform and raising her hand to answer a question only she could hear. At the bottom of the photograph, written in that familiar, careful script, was a single line: "The eternal classroom thanks you for your understanding." Agent Martinez set the photograph aside and picked up her phone. She had spent 30 years trying to solve the mystery of Thomas Whitmore, but perhaps, she thought, some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Perhaps some mysteries were meant to be experienced. She dialed the number for the local elementary school and asked to speak to the principal about volunteer opportunities. After all, she had always loved working with children. And somewhere, in a classroom that existed between moments, Thomas Whitmore smiled and opened his roll book to a fresh page.